Case 1. The Hakata Bay Incident. In June 2003, commercial divers inspecting the dark waters of Hakata Bay in Fukuoka, Japan, stumbled upon an anomaly. Weighted down by heavy industrial materials, the remains of an entire family rested at the bottom of the sea. The discovery immediately launched one of the most complex international manhunts in Japanese criminal history. Within weeks, the investigation would lead to 3 international exchange students. Ultimately, 2 would face the highest penalty under Chinese law, while the third would meet his fate in a Japanese execution chamber in 2019. To understand how 3 students crossed the line into total family annihilation, we have to go back to their arrival in a foreign land. Yang Enning, Wang Liang, and Wei Wei arrived in Japan seeking educational advancement. Enrolled in local language and computer schools in Fukuoka, they held the respected status of international students. They were granted visas, community trust, and the opportunity to build professional careers. The stakes for their success were high, carrying the heavy financial expectations of their families back home. However, academic pressure and financial strain began to erode their ambitions. Wang Liang and Yang Enning exhibited traits of entitlement and a growing resentment toward their financial limitations. They viewed their host country not as an opportunity, but as a resource to be exploited. Small ethical compromises began. They routinely skipped classes. They engaged in minor thefts to fund their lifestyle. Wei Wei, though initially hesitant, succumbed to peer influence, his need for inclusion overriding his moral compass. The gradual escalation from petty theft to a highly orchestrated home invasion was fueled by greed and a false sense of invincibility. They targeted the home of Masumi Watanabe, a successful local businessman. They studied the family's daily routines, tracking their movements to establish a timeline. The objective was purely financial. On the night of June 19, 2003, they infiltrated the Watanabe residence, but the situation rapidly destabilized. When Masumi, his wife Yumiko, 11-year-old Rina, and 8-year-old Kai recognized the intruders, the students made a calculated decision. Rather than retreat and face deportation, they chose to eliminate all witnesses. The robbery transformed into a methodical erasure of an entire household. When the Watanabe family failed to appear for their daily obligations, police initiated a search. The subsequent discovery in Hakata Bay provided the forensic catalyst. Detectives meticulously processed the weights and handcuffs used to submerge the victims. By cross-referencing manufacturing serial numbers and store inventory logs, financial records isolated the specific purchase of those items at a local sporting goods store, leading directly to Yang Enning and Wang Liang. Surveillance footage placed their vehicle near the bay on the night in question. Digital forensics, including cell phone tower pings, shattered their alibis. But before authorities could secure the arrest warrants, Yang and Wang boarded a flight to China, slipping through a massive systemic blind spot in international border control. Wei Wei remained in Japan and was quickly apprehended by authorities. His formal admission provided the remaining pieces of the timeline. The case then demanded unprecedented legal cooperation. Because Japan and China lack an extradition treaty, Yang and Wang could not be sent back to face trial. Instead, Japanese investigators forwarded all forensic data, witness testimonies, and physical evidence to Chinese prosecutors. Tried under Chinese jurisdiction, the 2 fugitives were found guilty based on the shared intelligence. Wang Liang received a suspended death sentence due to his cooperation with investigators, which later converted to life in prison. Yang Enning was executed in China in 2005. In Japan, Wei Wei faced the Fukuoka District Court. The prosecution presented an airtight case based on forensic tracking and his own statements. He received the ultimate penalty. Wei Wei spent over a decade on death row before his sentence was carried out in late 2019. The Hakata Bay Incident forced a complete reevaluation of international tracking systems for temporary visa holders and highlighted the absolute necessity of cross-border forensic sharing. It exposed how quickly ordinary greed can spiral into absolute devastation. The transformation of 3 students into perpetrators of a methodical family erasure serves as a dark lesson in human nature. When ambition is replaced by entitlement, and the fear of losing status outweighs the value of human life, the boundaries of morality vanish entirely. The depths of Hakata Bay were meant to hide their decisions forever, but objective evidence ensured their actions were dragged into the light. Case 2. Tomohiro Kato. On the afternoon of June 8, 2008, the bustling pedestrian zone of Akihabara, Tokyo, descended into unprecedented panic. Sirens echoed through the electronic district as authorities surrounded a 25-year-old man standing motionless in the center of the street. He dropped a tactical blade, raised his hands, and surrendered to the police without a struggle. This surrender marked the end of a meticulously planned mass casualty event that would ultimately lead to his execution on July 26, 2022. To understand how a quiet, unassuming temporary worker orchestrated a tragedy in broad daylight, we have to go back to his earliest psychological fractures. Kato was raised in a highly restrictive environment in Aomori Prefecture. His parents enforced intense academic standards, tying his self-worth entirely to his educational output. When he failed to secure entry into a prestigious university, his carefully constructed path collapsed. He secured a degree from a junior college instead and drifted into the temporary workforce. He lacked the social skills required to build a support network, leaving him profoundly isolated. Kato developed a psychological profile defined by deep resentment, insecurity, and a desperate craving for validation. Unable to find respect in his physical reality, he turned to the internet. He became heavily active on a sprawling, anonymous Japanese message board known as 2channel. Online, he could control his narrative. However, when his digital posts failed to generate the attention and sympathy he desired, his frustration mutated into outright hostility. The turning point occurred at his workplace. One morning, Kato arrived at his auto parts factory job to find his work uniform missing. Instead of asking management for a replacement, he interpreted this minor administrative error as a deliberate, systematic rejection by society. He walked out of the facility and never returned. His downward spiral accelerated rapidly. He spent his final days entirely consumed by his digital echo chamber. He began treating his online thread as a live broadcast of his impending vengeance. In the aftermath of the Akihabara attack, digital forensic teams uncovered the staggering extent of his premeditation. Kato had left a highly detailed, minute-by-minute digital footprint. Investigators cataloged over 1,000 messages posted in the days leading up to the event. The evidence was irrefutable. Kato documented his journey to a military surplus store to purchase the weapon. He recorded the rental of a 2-ton truck. On the morning of the attack, he posted his exact timeline, writing from his mobile phone as he drove toward Tokyo. He stated his clear intent to drive the vehicle into a crowded intersection and attack anyone within reach. The digital logs exposed a massive systemic blind spot. Hundreds of anonymous users had read his exact operational blueprint in real time. Yet, the structural mechanisms to monitor, flag, and intercept these blatant online threats simply did not exist within Japanese law enforcement at the time. The public warnings were treated as internet bravado until it was far too late. During the trial, the prosecution weaponized Kato's own words against him. The defense attempted to argue that severe psychological distress and extreme social isolation diminished his capacity for judgment. However, the prosecution systematically dismantled this defense using the digital evidence. The timestamp forum posts proved absolute, calculated premeditation. Kato knew exactly what he was doing, and he wanted an audience for it. The Tokyo District Court delivered a guilty verdict, sentencing Kato to death. The sentence was carried out in the summer of 2022. The Akihabara incident forced an immediate nationwide reckoning. It catalyzed strict legislative reforms regarding the possession of double-edged knives and prompted the implementation of advanced online threat surveillance protocols by cyber police units. Beyond the legal reforms, the case left a haunting psychological legacy. Tomohiro Kato was a man who felt entirely invisible. In his pursuit to force the world to finally acknowledge his existence, he bypassed every societal safeguard. His actions serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked isolation. When profound resentment is allowed to fester in the unmonitored shadows of the digital world, the consequences inevitably spill over into the physical one, destroying innocent lives just to satisfy a fragile, broken ego. Case 3. Tsutomu Miyazaki. In the heat of July 1989, a vigilant father in a Tokyo park noticed a quiet, unassuming young man forcing his attention upon a young girl. Acting on immediate instinct, the father intervened, confronting the stranger and holding him until law enforcement arrived. The suspect appeared entirely ordinary, a quiet man who blended seamlessly into the background of the city. Yet this single act of parental intervention brought an abrupt end to the most terrifying psychological manhunt in modern Japanese history. For his systematic targeting of the most vulnerable members of society, this quiet man would face the ultimate judgment, his life ending in an execution chamber in 2008. To understand how he got here, we have to go back to a childhood defined by profound detachment and unchecked isolation. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born into a comfortable family, but early physical insecurities isolated him from his peers. A minor deformity in his hands became a source of deep psychological shame, causing him to retreat entirely from social interaction. Instead of building human connections, he constructed an alternate reality. He amassed a staggering collection of media, retreating into a private world where he held absolute control. His grandfather, passing severed his final tether to healthy emotional reality, leaving him completely untethered from societal norms. His detachment slowly morphed into something predatory. The ethical compromises began in his mind, where the line between reality and dark fantasy dissolved. Armed with a black Nissan Langley, he began cruising suburban neighborhoods, exploiting the inherent trust of communities where children freely played outside their homes. Between August 1988 and June 1989, the illusion of safety was shattered. 4 young girls vanished without a trace: 4-year-old Mari Kano, 7-year-old Masami Yashizawa, 4-year-old Erika Namba, and 5-year-old Ayako Nemoto. As Tokyo police scrambled to establish a pattern, Miyazaki escalated his control by waging a calculated campaign of psychological warfare against the grieving families. Operating under a female pseudonym to confuse the investigation, he mailed anonymous, taunting letters constructed from magazine cutouts. He sent the victims' personal items and physical evidence directly to their homes. The systemic blind spot was absolute. Law enforcement was searching for a traditional criminal profile, completely missing the isolated young man hiding in plain sight. The breakthrough did not originate in a forensic laboratory, but from the community itself. Following his arrest at the park, investigators traced the registration of his vehicle. The subsequent search of his residence exposed an overwhelming cache of evidence. Detectives uncovered thousands of videotapes, photographs, and the victim's personal belongings meticulously hidden in his bedroom. Witness statements placed his black Nissan Langley near the abduction zones, confirming his methodical surveillance of the neighborhoods. During the highly publicized trial, the courtroom became a battleground over psychological accountability. The defense argued that severe mental fragmentation rendered him incapable of bearing criminal responsibility, claiming he existed entirely within a delusional construct. The prosecution, however, countered with the undeniable evidence of premeditation. The targeted routes, the deliberate psychological torment of the families, and the calculated steps taken to evade capture proved he knew exactly what he was doing. The court agreed, determining that his actions were the result of conscious, methodical planning rather than mere delusion. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was carried out in 2008, closing the legal chapter, but the societal impact of his crimes was permanent. The case forced a massive cultural shift across the nation. The inherent trust of suburban life was irrevocably altered, replaced by stringent parental vigilance, the establishment of strict community boundaries, and comprehensive child safety education programs. The predator in plain sight proved that the most dangerous threats do not always arrive with obvious warning signs. They often operate in the quiet margins, shielded by an ordinary appearance. When extreme isolation and obsession are left unchallenged, they can quietly erode a person's humanity, leaving behind a void that seeks to consume the innocent. The case remains a chilling reminder that true safety relies not just on law enforcement, but on the watchful eyes of a community unwilling to look away. Case 4. Futoshi Matsunaga. In March 2002, a terrified 17-year-old girl broke out of a locked apartment in Kitakyushu, Japan, and fled to her grandparents' house. She was malnourished, exhausted, and highly traumatized. Her desperate escape fractured the walls of a silent, invisible prison, exposing a criminal enterprise built entirely on psychological domination. The architect of this hidden nightmare would ultimately be sentenced to death, convicted of orchestrating the systematic destruction of multiple individuals, including an entire family, without ever raising a weapon himself. To understand how he got here, we have to go back to his early days as a charismatic businessman. Futoshi Matsunaga presented a flawless public image. In the 1980s, he operated a futon sales company. He was exceptionally articulate, impeccably dressed, and possessed a magnetic charm that immediately disarmed clients and employees alike. People trusted him. He commanded respect by projecting immense confidence and financial success, easily convincing others to invest in his vision. Beneath the polished exterior lay a calculating predator defined by absolute narcissism and a pathological need for dominance. Matsunaga had a terrifying talent for identifying a person's deepest insecurities and exploiting them. He did not seek physical violence. He sought total psychological ownership of those around him. His first ethical compromises were financial. He routinely engaged in fraud and extortion, coercing employees into taking on immense debt and forcing them to depend on him for survival. When he began a relationship with Junko Agata, a woman from a respectable and wealthy family, his tactics shifted. He systematically isolated her, cutting off her support networks, draining her finances, and establishing himself as the sole authority in her life. When his business collapsed under the weight of his financial crimes, the couple went on the run, eventually settling in Kitakyushu. Here, the manipulation escalated into a closed-door regime. Matsunaga infiltrated Junko's immediate family, pulling her parents, sister, brother-in-law, and their children into his controlled environment. He bypassed obvious systemic red flags by presenting the situation to outsiders as a private family dispute over debt. Behind closed doors, he implemented a rigid, terrifying system of behavioral conditioning. He used extreme sleep deprivation, severe food restriction, and applied targeted electric shocks to punish disobedience. Matsunaga fabricated massive debts and pitted family members against one another, forcing them to enforce his rules to avoid punishment themselves. The psychological breakdown was so complete that Junko's family turned inward, dismantling themselves from the inside just to survive his manufactured hierarchy. The crimes remained completely undetected by neighbors and authorities until the 17-year-old survivor finally escaped. When investigators raided the Kitakyushu apartment, they found no physical remains. However, they uncovered a disturbing trove of evidence. Detectives seized detailed ledgers documenting the financial extortion, meticulously kept audio recordings of the abuse, and the electrical equipment used for coercion. The systemic nature of the crimes had been highly organized. The investigative turning point arrived when Junko Agata, finally removed from Matsunaga's immediate control and placed in police custody, broke her silence. Her extensive testimony provided the exact timeline of how her own family was systematically erased under his strict orders. Forensic accountants traced the money, proving that Matsunaga had drained the family's assets while orchestrating their demise. During the trial, the prosecution presented a groundbreaking case. They argued that Matsunaga was entirely culpable for the fatalities, even though he manipulated others into carrying out the final acts. He had effectively weaponized human psychology. The Fukuoka District Court agreed, ruling that his coercive control was the direct cause of the family's destruction. Futoshi Matsunaga was sentenced to death. Junko Agata was sentenced to life in prison. The Kitakyushu case fundamentally altered the Japanese legal framework, becoming a definitive criminological study on domestic psychological domination. It exposed a massive systemic failure, revealing how deeply a predator can operate when shielded by the privacy of a household. The architecture of manipulation relies entirely on the betrayal of trust. Matsunaga proved that chains are not always made of iron. They can be forged from fear, debt, and emotional dependency. When extreme psychological control goes unrecognized, the human mind can be forced to abandon its deepest loyalties. The case stands as a harrowing lesson in the necessity of recognizing emotional abuse before the invisible boundaries of a home become a prison from which there is no escape. Case 5 Hiroshi Maeue. In late 2005, digital forensics experts in Osaka intercepted a trail of electronic handshakes hidden deep within Internet server logs. The fragmented data pointed directly to a single, unremarkable apartment. When investigators finally breached the residence, they did not find a heavily armed fugitive. Instead, they found a quiet, unassuming man sitting calmly at his computer terminal. This digital footprint would expose one of the most calculated betrayals of trust in modern history, ultimately leading to his execution in the summer of 2009. To understand how the Internet was weaponized to erase 3 innocent lives, we have to go back to his early disconnect from society. Hiroshi Maeue struggled with severe psychological anomalies from a young age. Unable to form healthy, stable bonds in the physical world, he retreated into the rapidly expanding digital landscape. He possessed a sharp intellect but lacked fundamental empathy, viewing human interaction purely as a transactional exercise designed to satisfy his own dark fixations. The anonymity of the Internet provided the perfect camouflage. Maeue gravitated toward online support forums, specifically infiltrating digital spaces where individuals expressed severe emotional distress and isolation. He understood the mechanics of vulnerability. Instead of offering genuine support, he created an online persona built entirely on fabricated empathy. He was patient, highly articulate, and presented himself as a safe harbor for the broken. The ethical boundaries vanished entirely when he identified 3 highly vulnerable targets: 25-year-old Michiko Nagamode, a 21-year-old man, and a 14-year-old boy. Maeue engaged them in prolonged, intimate private messaging. He validated their struggles, mirrored their pain, and eventually offered them a definitive, painless escape. He proposed a pact, promising to meet them in person to peacefully end their lives together using carbon monoxide. The pact was an absolute lie. Maeue had no intention of ending his own life. When the victims arrived at the isolated meeting locations, fully trusting the man they had confided in for weeks, the illusion instantly vanished. Maeue ambushed them, discarding the promised method and executing a violent betrayal solely to satisfy his own predatory compulsions. The disappearances initially appeared completely unrelated. The victims varied widely in age and background, sharing no physical connections or mutual acquaintances. However, missing persons detectives eventually identified a crucial pattern in their final movements. Every victim had abruptly ceased all digital communication just hours before vanishing. Recognizing the anomaly, law enforcement pivoted their focus from the physical streets to the cyber realm. Investigators subpoenaed internet service providers, initiating a complex digital manhunt. Cybercrime units extracted deleted emails, traced masked proxy servers, and mapped complex IP addresses. The fragmented electronic data slowly coalesced into a single, undeniable point of convergence. The server logs proved that all three victims had communicated with the exact same IP address in their final hours. Those digital breadcrumbs led investigators straight to Hiroshi Maeue's keyboard. During the trial, the prosecution presented a devastating timeline of premeditation. They did not just rely on physical evidence. They projected the chat logs into the courtroom. The digital transcripts revealed the cold, methodical nature of his deception, proving he spent weeks cultivating trust with the explicit, calculated intent to exploit it. The defense's attempt to minimize his culpability crumbled under the weight of his own typed words. The Osaka District Court handed down the highest penalty. Hiroshi Maeue was executed in 2009. His case forced an immediate nationwide reckoning regarding digital safety and systemic blind spots. Internet service providers and mental health organizations were forced to collaborate, establishing strict monitoring protocols for online forums to intercept vulnerable individuals before predators could reach them. The digital trap exposed a terrifying reality about the modern age. Anonymity can serve as a shield for the vulnerable, but it can also be the ultimate weapon for the manipulative. Maeue proved that true danger no longer requires physical force or a weapon to breach a home. It only requires an internet connection and the patience to exploit a broken heart. When society fails to protect its most fragile members, predators waiting in the digital void will eagerly consume them. Case 6 Matsuoto. In the early hours of May 21, 1938, the remote village of Kamo in Okayama Prefecture descended into absolute silence. When local authorities finally breached the isolated community, they were met with a chilling scene. The main power lines had been deliberately severed, plunging the entire valley into darkness. Across the village, 30 individuals were discovered deceased in their homes. The perpetrator had not fled jurisdiction. He was located in the nearby mountains, having taken his own life before investigators could even initiate a pursuit. 30 people perished in a highly orchestrated, single-night event that permanently scarred Japanese history. To understand how an entire community was systematically dismantled by one of their own, we have to go back to the collapse of his social standing. Matsuoto began his life with bright prospects. Raised primarily by his grandmother after the early loss of his parents, he was an exceptionally intelligent and capable student. The community viewed him as a promising young man, and he was fully expected to secure a respected position as a local teacher. He enjoyed the social inclusion of the tight-knit village, drawing his confidence and self-worth entirely from the validation of his neighbors. However, his personality was defined by a fragile ego and a desperate need for acceptance. His identity relied entirely on how the community perceived him. The turning point arrived when he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. In the 1930s, this illness carried an intense, unforgiving social stigma. The villagers, operating on fear and self-preservation, immediately and completely ostracized him. The rejection was absolute. Neighbors who once welcomed him into their homes now refused to acknowledge his presence. The systemic blind spot was the community's failure to recognize the psychological toll of complete, forced isolation. Stripped of his future and his social standing, Toy's despair mutated into profound, unyielding resentment. He began to view the entire village as a singular, hostile entity that had unjustly revoked his right to exist among them. Small behavioral shifts went unnoticed by the people avoiding him. He withdrew further into the shadows, quietly obtaining a hunting license and purchasing a Browning shotgun. He spent hours in the surrounding forests, practicing his aim, mapping the terrain, and studying the layout of the homes that had shut him out. The spiral was entirely internalized, a quiet escalation fueled by total alienation. His retaliation was calculated down to the minute. On the night of the event, Toy executed a flawless tactical operation. He climbed the local utility poles and severed the electrical lines, ensuring Kamo was entirely cut off from the outside world. Because he knew the terrain intimately, the lack of light gave him absolute control. He navigated the pitch-black village using a modified headband equipped with 2 flashlights, armed with the Browning shotgun and a traditional sword. Moving methodically from house to house, he carried out his grievances against those he believed had wronged him, bypassing the homes of the few who had shown him continued kindness. When investigators processed the aftermath, they found no mystery regarding the perpetrator's identity or his motives. Toy had left behind extensive, handwritten notes. These documents served as the ultimate forensic evidence of his psychological state. He meticulously detailed his preparations, his exact timeline, and the specific resentments that fueled his actions. The notes proved this was not a sudden loss of control, but a deeply premeditated response to systematic social exclusion. Because he ended his own life, Matsuo Toy never faced a courtroom. However, the tragedy forced a permanent reckoning within rural Japan. The Tsuyama incident remains a stark historical lesson on the fatal consequences of community alienation. It exposed the extreme dangers of collective ostracization and the complete absence of mental health intervention in rural societies. The village massacre proves that isolation is not just a social consequence. It can become a catalyst for unimaginable devastation. When a community entirely turns its back on a fragile mind, stripping away all hope and belonging, the resulting silence can breed a resentment powerful enough to consume the very village that created it. Case 7, Seito Sakakibara. In late May 1997, the city of Kobe, Japan, awoke to a chilling discovery placed deliberately outside the gates of a local junior high school. It was a handwritten note, penned in striking red ink, directly challenging law enforcement to a twisted game. The author openly claimed responsibility for a string of violent encounters that had paralyzed the surrounding neighborhoods. The media, the public, and veteran detectives all believed they were hunting a highly organized, seasoned adult predator. Instead, the architect of this widespread terror was a 14-year-old boy. His eventual capture would completely rewrite Japanese law, forcing the government to lower the age of criminal responsibility to address a new era of youth violence. To understand how a middle school student became a master manipulator, we have to go back to his early psychological divergence. Born into an unremarkable household in Kobe, the boy who would later be known to the world solely by the media alias Seito Sakakibara presented an ordinary facade. However, a profound lack of empathy defined his internal psychological profile. He possessed an extreme arrogance, convinced he was intellectually superior to his peers, his teachers, and authority figures. He viewed the world not as a collaborative community, but as a rigid hierarchy where he belonged at the absolute apex, unbound by the rules that governed ordinary citizens. The systemic blind spot in this case was the societal assumption of childhood innocence. The early warning signs were entirely missed or dismissed as mere adolescent acting out. He developed a deep obsession with extremist literature, consuming dark ideological texts far beyond his years. This media consumption fueled a dangerous superiority complex. His ethical boundaries eroded quietly. He began with minor acts of cruelty against local wildlife, testing the limits of his control and his ability to evade detection. When these actions went unnoticed by the adults around him, his need for absolute dominance demanded higher stakes. The spiral was entirely internalized, escalating from dark fantasies into the calculated targeting of those smaller and weaker than himself. In the spring of 1997, this escalation breached the point of no return. 10-year-old Ayaka Yamashita and 11-year-old Jun Hase were targeted in separate, fatal encounters. The community was thrown into absolute panic. Parents enforced strict curfews. Schools operated under lockdown conditions. The predator operated with complete impunity, heavily shielded by the unimaginable reality of his actual age. The investigative turning point arrived when the killer's ego demanded an audience. He sent extensive, taunting letters to the Kobe Shimbun newspaper. Using the Sakakibara alias, he mocked the police investigation and demanded widespread recognition for his intellect. Investigators meticulously analyzed the documents. Forensic profilers and linguists dissected the phrasing, expecting to find the profile of an adult male. Instead, they discovered glaring anomalies. The handwriting, the specific vocabulary, and the structural errors hidden within the complex rhetoric pointed away from a seasoned criminal and directly toward a juvenile. Detectives cross-referenced local school records with behavioral reports. They zeroed in on a 14-year-old student whose recent behavioral shifts aligned perfectly with the forensic profile. Upon his apprehension, a search of his personal belongings yielded irrefutable proof. Investigators recovered a private diary that documented his entire progression and perfectly mirrored the exact rhetoric published in the newspaper letters. Because of his status as a minor, the Japanese legal system protected his true identity. The proceedings bypassed standard criminal courts, moving instead into the juvenile justice system. The prosecution presented the diary and linguistic evidence, proving undeniable premeditation and a clear understanding of right and wrong. He was found responsible for the crimes and remanded to a juvenile medical reformatory for long-term psychiatric rehabilitation, completely avoiding an adult prison sentence. The leniency of the juvenile code sparked immediate nationwide outrage. Recognizing the systemic failure to hold extreme juvenile offenders accountable, the Japanese government lowered the age of criminal responsibility from 16 to 14 in the year 2000. Controversially, Sakakibara was released back into society in 2004, a decision that continues to fuel intense national debates over the fragile balance between youth rehabilitation and community safety. The juvenile anomaly shattered the illusion that profound danger only arrives in the form of an adult. Seito Sakakibara proved that arrogance and manipulation are not bound by age. When early warning signs are ignored under the assumption of youthful innocence, the consequences can devastate a community. His legacy remains a dark lesson in vigilance, proving that society must remain willing to look closely at the shadows, even when those shadows are cast by a child. Case 8. Issei Sagawa. In June 1981, French authorities patrolling the Bois de Boulogne, a sprawling public park on the western edge of Paris, were flagged down by concerned witnesses. A man had been spotted struggling with two heavy, leaking suitcases near a lake. When police intercepted the suspect a short time later, he offered no resistance. He immediately confessed to the contents of the luggage and the unthinkable crime that preceded it. The physical evidence was absolute, and a conviction seemed like a mere formality. Yet despite a full confession and overwhelming forensic proof, this man would never see the inside of a prison cell. Because of a staggering loophole in international extradition law, he would walk free, live a public life of notoriety in his home country, and die of natural causes in November 2022. To understand how a confessed killer legally evaded justice, we have to go back to his arrival in Europe. Born into an incredibly wealthy and highly influential Japanese family, Issei Sagawa grew up insulated from consequence. He was small in stature, physically frail, and plagued by deep insecurities regarding his appearance. However, his family's immense financial resources afforded him extraordinary privilege. In 1977, he relocated to Paris to pursue a doctoral degree in literature at the Sorbonne. He presented himself as a dedicated, harmless intellectual. He easily earned the trust of his peers, blending seamlessly into the prestigious academic community. Beneath this quiet academic persona, Sagawa harbored dark, predatory obsessions. He possessed a dangerous combination of profound insecurity and extreme entitlement. His wealth allowed him to bypass normal social friction, breeding an arrogance that convinced him he was exempt from moral boundaries. The early warning signs were subtle but highly disturbing. He developed inappropriate fixations on his classmates, specifically targeting individuals he deemed physically superior to compensate for his own perceived inadequacies. The spiral escalated when he fixated on René Hartevelt, a 25-year-old Dutch student. Sagawa weaponized the academic environment to gain her trust. He presented himself as a helpful colleague, offering to pay her for language tutoring. This was a fatal betrayal disguised entirely as academic collaboration. On June 11, 1981, he invited Hartevelt to his apartment under the pretense of translating German poetry. As she sat reading at his desk, completely unguarded and trusting her peer, Sagawa retrieved a rifle and carried out his premeditated plan. The investigation required very little detective work. Sagawa spent 2 clumsy days attempting to conceal his actions before packing the evidence into the suitcases and hailing a taxi to the park. Following his arrest, French police raided his apartment, recovering the weapon, financial documents, and additional physical proof. The timeline was clear, the motive was documented, and the confession was on tape. However, the trial phase initiated a massive systemic collapse. Sagawa was subjected to extensive psychological evaluation by French authorities. The defense heavily emphasized his lifelong psychological anomalies and physical insecurities. The French judge ultimately ruled that Sagawa was criminally insane at the time of the offense, making him legally unfit to stand trial. Instead of facing a murder conviction and a prison sentence, he was committed to a French psychiatric institution. The aftermath exposed a fatal flaw in global jurisdiction. Sagawa's wealthy family immediately began aggressive legal lobbying for his transfer. In 1984, he was deported back to Japan. Upon his arrival at a Tokyo hospital, Japanese psychiatrists evaluated him and reached a completely contradictory conclusion. They determined Sagawa was legally sane, fully culpable for his actions, and acting entirely out of malice rather than delusion. Japanese prosecutors immediately moved to press criminal charges. To proceed, they requested the original case files from France. Citing the previous ruling of criminal insanity, French authorities permanently sealed the documents and flatly refused to release the forensic evidence or the confession records to Japan. Without that evidence, Japanese prosecutors were legally paralyzed. The charges had to be dropped. Sagawa was discharged from the hospital 15 months later as a free man. He spent the next 4 decades walking the streets of Tokyo, shamelessly exploiting his notoriety through media appearances and books until his death. The case of Issei Sagawa remains one of the most glaring examples of systemic failure in modern legal history. It proves that wealth and international bureaucracy can sometimes construct an impenetrable shield around the guilty. When global legal systems refuse to share evidence, the pursuit of justice is abandoned entirely, leaving a predator to live out his days while the victim is denied any semblance of closure. Case 9, Yashio Codera. In the devastated ruins of Tokyo in 1946, investigators searching the rubble uncovered a terrifying reality. Amidst the chaos of a nation trying to rebuild from the ashes of World War II, a series of missing women were initially dismissed as casualties of widespread systemic collapse. But physical evidence soon proved they were the targets of a highly organized, single predator. The man responsible would ultimately be captured and executed in 1949, marking a historic turning point in criminal investigation. To understand how a predator thrived in the shadows of a broken society, we have to go back to his early acquisition of power. Yashio Codera spent his early adulthood immersed in strict military environments. He deployed to combat zones where the normal rules of civil society did not apply. In this rigid hierarchy, he discovered a deep affinity for absolute authority. He learned how to command obedience and recognized how easily fear could be used to manipulate the vulnerable. The military structure provided him with a respectable facade, shielding his developing psychological anomalies beneath the uniform of a disciplined, trusted soldier. Beneath that uniform, Codera possessed a severe lack of empathy and a calculating arrogance. He viewed human beings not as equals, but as resources to be exploited for his own gratification. The early warning signs appeared during his service, where he engaged in violent, unauthorized abuses of power that were largely ignored by a system distracted by global conflict. These ethical compromises normalized his predatory behavior. When the war ended and he returned to a shattered Japan, he brought his dangerous psychological framework back to the civilian world. Post-war Japan offered the perfect camouflage for a predator. The economy was destroyed, rationing was severe, and millions were displaced. Codera recognized a massive systemic blind spot. He specifically targeted women who were isolated, grieving, and desperately seeking basic necessities or employment to survive. Presenting himself as a well-connected, trustworthy figure, he offered them black market food or lucrative job opportunities. This false promise of security was his primary weapon. He led them away from the crowded urban centers and into the desolate, bombed-out ruins where law enforcement simply did not patrol. Once they were completely isolated, the illusion of safety vanished, and he executed his fatal betrayals. For months, local police treated the disappearances as isolated incidents. In a nation where people vanished daily due to starvation or displacement, connecting the cases seemed impossible. But as evidence quietly mounted, a small group of detectives realized they were facing a new kind of threat. They were forced to evolve their tactics. Instead of treating each case independently, investigators began tracking behavioral patterns. They noted the specific demographic of the victims and the identical false promises used to lure them. This critical shift in methodology laid the groundwork for modern serial profiling in Japanese law enforcement. The turning point arrived through careful forensic tracking of stolen property. Codera had routinely taken the personal belongings and clothing of his victims, selling them on the thriving underground black market for personal profit. Detectives meticulously traced a specific piece of stolen clothing back through the fractured economy, identifying the vendor and ultimately pointing directly to Codera. When investigators raided his residence, they recovered a cache of the victim's possessions. Witness statements from individuals who had narrowly avoided his traps further solidified his distinct operational timeline. The physical evidence shattered his confident denials. During the trial, the prosecution presented a devastating narrative of exploitation. They did not just rely on the recovered belongings. They highlighted his systematic weaponization of post-war desperation. The defense attempted to blur his actions into the overall tragedy of the era, but the court recognized the cold, premeditated nature of his deception. He had deliberately hunted the most vulnerable members of a fractured society when they were simply trying to survive. The court delivered a guilty verdict, sentencing Codera to death. He was executed in 1949, removing a ruthless predator from a recovering nation. The case of Yashio Codera exposed a chilling truth about systemic collapse. When societal structures fail and desperation takes hold, predators will inevitably weaponize that chaos. His crimes forced law enforcement to look beyond isolated events and recognize the psychological signatures of serial behavior. The legacy of this investigation proves that protecting the vulnerable requires not just rebuilding cities, but actively anticipating the hidden dangers that thrive in the ruins. Case 10, Sada Abe. In the early morning hours of May 18, 1936, the staff at a secluded Tokyo Inn breached a locked guest room and uncovered a chilling scene. A prominent local restaurant owner, Kichizo Ishida, lay deceased, the victim of a highly orchestrated and deeply personal attack. The woman who had checked in with him was gone. The discovery triggered an immediate nationwide manhunt, dominating the front pages of every Japanese newspaper. When authorities finally tracked the suspect to another hotel days later, they did not find a frantic fugitive. They found a woman sitting in eerie, cooperative calmness, ready to detail exactly what she had done. Despite the severe and calculated nature of her actions, Sada Abe would serve only 5 years in prison. Upon her release in 1941, she did not fade into obscurity. She bizarrely ascended to the status of a minor cultural celebrity. To understand how extreme emotional dependency bypassed the justice system and captured a nation's fascination, we have to go back to her early navigation of Tokyo's social margins. Born into a respectable merchant family, Abe chafed under strict traditional expectations. Seeking autonomy, she entered Tokyo's complex entertainment and service industry. Working in various establishments, she developed a deep understanding of human psychology. She learned how to command attention, projecting a magnetic, devoted persona that easily disarmed the wealthy and influential men she served. Beneath this charismatic exterior, however, lay a profoundly unstable psychological foundation. Abe was driven by a pathological fear of abandonment. She did not view relationships as collaborative partnerships. She viewed them as absolute ownership. Her personality was defined by intense jealousy and a dangerous equation of possessiveness with love. The early warning signs emerged when she secured employment at a restaurant owned by Kichizo Ishida. Their professional relationship rapidly dissolved into a deeply unprofessional, all-consuming dynamic. Abe initiated small, calculated ethical compromises. She demanded more of his schedule. She manipulated situations to ensure he spent less time at his business and away from his family, slowly establishing a perimeter around his life. The spiral accelerated when the couple abandoned their daily responsibilities entirely, checking into a private inn to isolate themselves from the outside world. Behind closed doors, the dynamic shifted from intense affection to absolute coercive control. Abe's psychological state deteriorated as she fixated on a single, inescapable reality. Ishida had a wife, and eventually, he would leave the inn. The fear of losing her total dominance over him fractured her remaining grip on reality. She made a calculated decision. The only way to guarantee he would never leave her was to ensure he could never leave the room. Following her quiet exit from the inn, the investigation moved swiftly. Detectives did not need complex forensic reconstruction. The physical evidence was entirely self-contained. The primary investigative task was locating the suspect. Police mobilized across Tokyo, distributing her photograph and tracing her movements through the city's transit and hospitality networks. When detectives finally apprehended her, the most compelling evidence was her own immediate, unrepentant confession. She provided authorities with a chillingly lucid timeline of the betrayal, showing absolutely no remorse for the loss of life, only a twisted satisfaction that Ishida was permanently hers. During the trial, the courtroom transformed into a media spectacle. The prosecution presented a clear case of premeditated, calculated malice. However, the defense successfully capitalized on the intense public fascination with the case, arguing that Abe was driven by an overwhelming, temporary emotional breakdown. The judge, swayed by the unprecedented psychological dynamics and the intense media framing of a crime of passion, delivered a shockingly lenient verdict. Sada Abe was sentenced to just 5 years in prison. She walked out of a prison facility in 1941 and seamlessly transitioned into a public figure, writing an autobiography and even starring in a stage production about her own life. The justice system had fundamentally failed to hold her accountable for a fatal act of coercive control. The case of Sada Abe remains a prime example of the dangerous boundaries of emotional instability. It proved that extreme possessiveness can easily camouflage itself as devotion until it is far too late. When a society romanticizes obsession and fails to recognize the severe threat of psychological domination, predators are allowed to rebrand their violence as love, walking free while their victims are silenced forever.